Never underestimate the quiet ones. When a teacher decided to embarrass a hijab-wearing girl in front of the whole class, she expected failure. What she didn't know was that the girl she mocked was hiding a mind sharper than anyone in the room, including her own child. And when the truth finally came out, the teacher's world turned upside down. Some people believe that silence means weakness, that shyness means incompetence. But what if the quietest person in the room turned out to be the smartest? This is the story of how one teacher's attempt to humiliate a student backfired in the most unexpected way, forcing her to confront her own hidden biases. At Hillside Academy in Georgia, 15-year-old Aisha Malik was the kind of student people overlooked. She wasn't the loudest in class, nor was she the kind to compete for attention. She sat in the back, her hijab neatly wrapped, her notebooks always open, but her eyes often gazing out the window, lost in thought. She wasn't daydreaming, she was thinking. Numbers, equations, patterns, they all made sense to her in a way words never could. Math was her secret world, a place where logic ruled and everything had an answer. But no one at school knew this. No one had ever bothered to ask. The problem wasn't Aisha's ability, it was the assumptions people made about her. Some thought she was too quiet to be intelligent. Some thought her reserved nature meant she wasn't interested. And some, like her math teacher, Ms. Reynolds, thought that if she wasn't actively participating, she probably wasn't very good at all. Ms. Reynolds prided herself on being an engaging teacher. She encouraged debate, discussion, and active problem solving. But there was an unspoken rule in her classroom. If you weren't raising your hand, you weren't worth noticing. And Aisha? She never raised her hand. She didn't need to. The answers were always in her mind, but the idea of speaking out, of stepping into the spotlight, made her uneasy. She wasn't afraid of being wrong. She was afraid of being seen. Ms. Reynolds had made up her mind about Aisha long ago. She saw a quiet hijab-wearing girl who barely spoke in class, and she assumed she was just another student floating through the system, not struggling, but not excelling either. But that assumption was about to cost her. Because on one ordinary Tuesday, after a long and frustrating morning, Ms. Reynolds decided to prove a point. She was tired of students like Aisha, students who, in her eyes, weren't putting in enough effort, who weren't trying hard enough to engage. So, she made a decision, one that would change everything. She was going to put Aisha on the spot. She was going to make an example out of her, and in front of the whole class, she would soon learn just how wrong she had been. It started as an ordinary Tuesday. The classroom hummed with chatter as students settled into their seats, flipping through their math textbook. Some were half paying attention, others were still groggy from the early morning start. At the front of the room, Ms. Reynolds sighed, rubbing her temples. It had been a rough morning. Her 10-year-old son, Jake, had been struggling with math at home. She had spent hours tutoring him the night before, only to be met with frustration and complaints. Numbers didn't come easily to him, and no matter how hard she tried, he just couldn't grasp complex equations. And now, she was here, facing a classroom full of students who she assumed weren't trying hard enough, especially the quiet one. Her gaze swept over the room. Some students were lazily doodling in their notebooks, others whispering among themselves. And then her eyes landed on Aisha Malik, sitting in her usual seat at the back. There she was again, silent, unbothered, probably not even listening. Ms. Reynolds had had enough. She set her textbook down with a loud thud and crossed her arms. "All right, class," she announced, her tone sharp. "Let's see who's actually been paying attention." A few students glanced up, sensing the shift in her mood. Then her eyes locked on Aisha. "Aisha, come up to the board." Aisha's heart stopped. Her pencil froze mid-scribble. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, her mind racing. Had she done something wrong? Why was Ms. Reynolds calling on her? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the back of the class, to the girl who never volunteered to speak, let alone solve a problem in front of everyone. A few students exchanged amused glances. They knew what this was. Ms. Reynolds had done this before, to students who were too quiet, too withdrawn. She believed that if she pushed them into the spotlight, she could force them to engage. Except, this wasn't about participation. This was a test. Ms. Reynolds wasn't expecting Aisha to solve the problem. She was expecting her to fail. Aisha's fingers curled around the edges of her notebook. Her breath felt tight in her chest. She had spent years avoiding attention, carefully making herself small so that no one would expect too much from her. And now, she was being dragged into the very thing she feared the most. Ms. Reynolds turned to the board, picking up a marker. With a swift motion, She wrote down a complex algebraic equation, one that was far beyond what they had been taught in class. Aisha's stomach clenched. She recognized the equation instantly. It was something she had solved months ago on her own, long before they had even covered basic algebra in class. But the pressure of everyone watching, waiting for her to fail, made her hands tremble. Ms. Reynolds capped the marker and stepped aside, a smirk tugging at her lips. "All right, Aisha, let's see what you've got." The class erupted into whispers and muffled laughter. "Oh, this is going to be bad. She probably doesn't even know where to start. Why would she? She never talks." Aisha could hear them. She could feel the weight of their expectations. Failure. She hated this. Hated that people assumed things about her just because she was quiet. Hated that they mistook her silence for ignorance. Slowly, she stood up. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the front of the room, the sound of her footsteps loud against the classroom floor. When she reached the board, she hesitated. The whispers continued. Ms. Reynolds crossed her arms, waiting. Aisha closed her eyes for a brief second, and then she picked up the marker. The class went dead silent. Aisha stared at the equation, her mind instantly breaking it down into pieces. She knew this. She had solved equations 10 times harder in her free time. So why was she hesitating? Because this was more than just a math problem. This was about proving something. And in that moment, Aisha made a decision. She wouldn't let them define her. She wouldn't let their expectations box her in. She took a deep breath, and then she started writing. One number, a formula, a simplification, then another. The whispers stopped. The smirks faded. Ms. Reynolds' expression shifted from smugness to confusion. Aisha wasn't just solving the equation. She was solving it quickly, faster than any student in the class. Her handwriting was swift, precise, flowing like she had done this 1,000 times before. By the time she underlined the final answer, it had only been seconds. She put the marker down, turned around, and met Ms. Reynolds' stunned gaze. "Is this what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice calm. The room was silent, dead silent. Then, a collective gasp. Ms. Reynolds' mouth opened slightly, her eyes flickering between Aisha and the board. She grabbed the marker, checking the work, scanning for mistakes. There were none. The answer was perfect. The students who just moments ago had been laughing were now staring in disbelief. One by one, whispers spread across the room. She actually did it. Wait, how? That was insane. And then, something that had never happened in Ms. Reynolds' class before. Applause, not from one or two students, from the entire room. Aisha stood there, heart pounding, as the sound of clapping and murmurs of amazement filled the air. Ms. Reynolds took a step back, blinking in shock. She had called Aisha to the board to prove a point, but in the end, Aisha had been the one to teach her a lesson. And as she looked at the girl she had once dismissed, Ms. Reynolds felt a sinking realization settle in her chest. She had misjudged her, terribly, and now there was only one thing left to do. Ms. Reynolds stood frozen at the front of the class, her fingers tightening around the marker. Her eyes darted back and forth between the numbers on the board and the girl standing in front of her. Aisha Malik, the quiet student she had dismissed, the student she had just humiliated in front of the entire class. But now, she was the one humiliated. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned Aisha's work once again, desperately searching for an error. There wasn't one. Every step was flawless. Every calculation was perfect. The problem she had chosen deliberately, one she was certain none of her students could solve, had just been completed in seconds by the girl she assumed was weak, distracted, and incapable. Ms. Reynolds felt a sharp sting of shame settle in her chest. She had tried to prove a point, to expose Aisha's lack of ability. But instead, she had exposed something else, her own bias. And worse, the entire class had witnessed it. The same students who had snickered moments ago now sat wide-eyed, their mouths slightly open, processing what had just happened. Then, a chair scraped against the floor. A student stood up, clapping, then another, and another, until the entire room erupted into thunderous applause. Aisha's eyes widened. She had expected ridicule, laughter, another reason to keep herself hidden, but instead, she was standing in the center of something she had never experienced before. Recognition. The same classmates who had doubted her were now looking at her with awe, with respect. And Ms. Reynolds? She could barely breathe. Her face burned with embarrassment, but more than that, with regret. She had been a teacher for over a decade, yet she had failed to recognize true brilliance sitting right under her nose. And now, There was only one thing left to do. Ms. Reynolds stepped forward, clearing her throat. The classroom fell silent once more. "Aisha," she said, her voice quieter now, no longer filled with arrogance. "I owe you an apology." Aisha blinked, stunned. "I misjudged you," Ms. Reynolds continued. "I assumed that because you were quiet, you weren't capable. That was a mistake." A ripple of murmurs spread through the class. A teacher? Admitting she was wrong? Ms. Reynolds turned back to the board, running her fingers over the numbers Aisha had written. "This," she said, "is incredible." Aisha felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so much time hiding her intelligence, afraid of being seen, afraid of standing out. But now, there was no hiding anymore, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to. Ms. Reynolds turned back to her. "I'd like to recommend you for the Advanced Mathematics program." Gasps echoed through the room. The advanced program? Aisha's lips parted slightly. Her? In the advanced program? For years, she had watched other students be handpicked for that prestigious group. She had never been considered, not because she wasn't good enough, because no one had ever noticed her. Until now. The classroom waited, watching, as Aisha slowly lifted her chin, meeting Ms. Reynolds' gaze. And then, for the first time in her life, she nodded. And just like that, everything changed. The air in the classroom felt different now. Just moments ago, Aisha had been the quiet girl, the invisible student no one paid attention to, the one who sat in the back, never raising her hand, never speaking up. But now everyone was looking at her, not with amusement, not with pity, but with respect. And Ms. Reynolds? She still stood in front of the whiteboard, staring at Aisha like she was seeing her for the first time, like she was reevaluating everything she had ever assumed. Aisha's mind was racing. She had never wanted attention. She had never sought recognition. But at that moment, she realized something. Hiding her intelligence hadn't protected her. It had just allowed others to define her, and she was done with that. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but no one moved. The energy in the room was still electric, charged with the realization of what had just happened. Aisha turned to walk back to her seat when, "Wait," Ms. Reynolds' voice cut through the silence. Aisha paused. The class held its breath. Ms. Reynolds took a deep breath, still clearly shaken. But this time, her eyes held something different. Not authority, not doubt, genuine respect. "You should really consider joining the advanced math program." For a second, Aisha thought she misheard. Her? The program was reserved for the best, the students who had always been noticed, always been encouraged, always been at the top of their class. Aisha had never been given that opportunity before, not because she wasn't good enough, but because no one had ever believed in her enough to offer it, until now. The classroom buzzed with murmurs, students exchanging glances, some still struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Aisha's grip tightened around the strap of her backpack. She could say no. She could return to her quiet corner where no one expected much from her. But that moment, the moment where she had proven everyone wrong, felt too powerful to ignore. She took a deep breath and nodded. A smile tugged at the corner of Ms. Reynolds' lips. It wasn't forced. It wasn't out of obligation. It was pride. And for the first time, Aisha felt seen. A few weeks later, the change was immediate. Within days, Aisha found herself sitting in a new classroom, surrounded by students who were just like her, students who loved numbers, students who challenged her, students who saw the world through equations and possibilities. And the best part? She wasn't invisible anymore. At lunch, classmates who once ignored her now asked her for help. "Aisha, can you check my answer?" Even students from other grades whispered her name in the halls. Is that the girl who solved Ms. Reynolds' impossible problem? Ms. Reynolds, too, had changed. She no longer ignored the quiet students. Instead, she started paying closer attention to the ones who sat in the back, who never raised their hands, who seemed lost in thought. Because now she knew, silence doesn't mean weakness. Aisha, once afraid of standing out, had stepped into the spotlight, and she was finally ready to shine. Sometimes, the quietest people have the loudest minds. Aisha's story proves that true brilliance doesn't need to shout. It just needs a chance to shine. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.